Women often say to me, "Oh, I just don't have the capacity that I used to." And my reply to that is always, but what if our capacity actually hasn't reduced at all? What if it's just simply different after decades of doing everything for everybody else? Yet many women, again, have spent years juggling work, family, caregiving, households, and emotional stress. Menopause could be that moment for us when we realise that we just can't keep operating at that pace, and perhaps we're not meant to.
Welcome to Thriving in Menopause, brought to you by Prevention Magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier, the editor of Prevention. And today we're talking about the psychological reset of midlife. For those of us in our 40s and 50s, have you ever looked at your life and suddenly thought, is this really the life I want? For many women, menopause isn't just a hormonal shift, it's an emotional and psychological turning point. Long-held roles can start to feel different, relationships may change, and questions about identity, purpose, and priorities can rise to the surface. So what's really going on during this stage of life, and how can we navigate these shifts without feeling overwhelmed by them? To help us work through this midlife identity reset, we're joined today by counsellor Melinda McKeown. Melinda has spent nearly 20 years working in private practice. Her early work focused on perinatal mental health, but more recently, her focus has evolved to studying and supporting women through another major hormonal transition, menopause, helping them understand the emotional impact of hormonal change and to help them reconnect with themselves. Melinda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Zoe.
Many women describe menopause as less of a medical event and more of a psychological or identity reset. So what's actually happening emotionally in this stage of life?
Exactly, so true. Statistically, 1 in 3 women will experience depression and anxiety in perimenopause. So that's a pretty high number. But you're right. For many women, menopause isn't just that physical transition of the hot flushes. It feels more like an emotional and identity shift, because that's kind of exactly what's happening in the brain as well as the body. So, your hormones like estrogen, progesterone, they're not just reproductive hormones as we sort of, have always thought of them. They're quite neuroprotective. So what that means is that they've always supported our mood, our emotional regulation, our stress tolerance, memory, and just that natural sense of connection and nurturing that, most women have always had. Now, during perimenopause, the thing that happens is that these hormones, they fluctuate so wildly. And then in menopause, they just do that drop significantly and they stabilize a little bit, which is why the perimenopause period is actually the really tricky part to go through. So when that support system changes, many women do feel much more anxious, out of the blue often, irritable, flat, overwhelmed, and not because there's anything wrong with them, but just because their brain chemistry is actually changing. Those hormones that once promoted the bonding and the patience that we talk about, that caring for everybody else, that's really shifting. And it's the clearer boundaries. That's what this is bringing now. Less tolerance for burnout, and that strong, almost internal pull toward self-focus and self-protection. Yeah. So, when women can understand this, it can replace a lot of shame with compassion, and it can make this stage a little bit easier to navigate.
Yes, absolutely. So why do you think midlife also tends to bring sort of buried feelings or unresolved issues from the past to the surface?
Again, those hormonal supports that once helped us cope, and, we have always compartmentalized our lives with everything that we have to do, and we've always pushed through. It's all changing. So again, those repeat offenders, estrogen, progesterone, they play such a big role in that emotional regulation and stress tolerance. And as they do, that fluctuating in that perimenopause period again, and then decline in the menopause, the nervous system becomes a lot more sensitive. So that can mean that old emotions of grief, resentment, exhaustion, anything unresolved, those experiences, they're a little bit harder to suppress.
For sure. I mean, I guess that probably answering my next question, really. But then why so many people at this time of life really start to question everything from their career to their relationships and even their sense of purpose during this phase?
Yes. And this is another statistic that I always like to shout out, and it shocks so many people that up to 1 in 10 women will actually quit their jobs during menopause or perimenopause due to the unmanaged symptoms and that lack of understanding around what's going on. So the hormonal shifts, because they affect our energy, the way we're able to focus, our motivation, and our confidence is a big one. That takes such a big hit during perimenopause. So things that once felt quite manageable for us now feel quite exhausting and overwhelming. The brain fog, the fatigue, the emotional sensitivity, it starts to make women doubt themselves. So even when our skills and experience haven't actually disappeared, the hormones that once supported endurance, the people pleasing and that pushing through declining.
Absolutely. I mean, for women who are, experiencing all this happening and, understandably feeling quite unsettled by those shifts that they're seeing in themselves, how can they, I guess, rather than fearing this, how can they kind of lean into what they're experiencing and try and make the most out of it?
Yeah, and this is really important because I think I have always said patience and kindness first rather than judgment. So many changes happening for us emotionally, mentally, physically, and it's just the body trying to get used to this new hormonal, what would we call it, landscape, and it's not the body failing. I always really like to remind women of this. It's just a change. So sometimes it can help to zoom out and really recognize how incredible our bodies have already been. We've navigated puberty, monthly cycles, pregnancies, and breastfeeding for some, the stress of organizing everything for everybody, healing, and decades of change after change after change. And menopause, it's just another adaptive chapter, not a breakdown.
Yeah.
And I think for years, menopause has actually held a really negative connotation as opposed to all the other stages that we've been through. Menopause sort of is a bit of an outlier. That's always been framed as a bit of a decline because, oh, we must be getting old, and a loss. But sometimes I see in reality can be a really powerful recalibration. And when women understand what's happening and feel like they can openly talk about it, it can really shift from something to fear into something that can be navigated with support, confidence, and always compassion.
Now, I guess menopause also, in many ways, it can be a bit of a grieving process. Women might grieve their old identity, their previous roles, or their younger bodies, changing relationships, even their fertility. So, how can midlife women process that grief, and how do we differentiate that from depression or anxiety that we might also be feeling?
Yeah, I agree. Menopause really can be a bit of a grieving process. And I think that grief is so valid because women aren't just adjusting to physical changes. We are letting go of earlier identities, roles that we've played, expectations that we've had throughout our lives. Again, and like you mentioned, fertility and energy levels is a big one. And I think it makes a lot of sense to feel, a bit of sadness and loss or even anger at times. I think what's important is to never, ever dismiss those feelings or tell ourselves we should be grateful or just get on with it. Um, I think grief is always a natural response to any transition. And I think this stage of life, it involves a lot of transition, often all at once, and we're a little bit blindsided by it. So I think to process grief, it can help to do things like name it, acknowledging what has changed, and what's been lost, but without the judgment side of it. Talking about it with supportive people, other women that are going through the same thing is a huge help. Or a trained therapist that can be incredibly healing. But because so many women carry these feelings on their own, and I think a lot of that also has to do with just not knowing what's going on. And then on the other side of it, I think depression as a clinical diagnosis without perimenopause and menopause, and this is very generally speaking, it is usually that more persistent and, pervasive with that heavy, flat mood most days
Yeah.
with, the typical loss of interest or pleasure in things that we used to enjoy doing, low motivation, changes in sleep, appetite, and that what happens is that they don't lift over time.
Yeah.
Grief in menopause more so tends to come in waves, and it's often linked to specific losses or changes. And even within the sadness, there are still moments of connection, relief, and hope through menopause. But I would say that it can be really difficult to differentiate between the two because there's such an overlap with them. And that's why a lot of women feel the way that they do. And that's why it's really important to, please see a trusted menopause trained GP or therapist if you are feeling like this.
Yes. Yes, 100%. Let's talk about one of the identity shifts that many women describe. A lot of women say menopause is a time when they start to feel invisible. So, how does that sense of invisibility affect things like self esteem and mental health?
Um, you mentioned that one of the ways that our identity can change during menopause. And I find as a bit of a collective that long held roles begin to shift, particularly the role of being constantly needed, and the doer for everything and everybody. And, many women, like we said before, have spent decades caring for others, raising children, supporting partners, managing households, helping aging parents. The list goes on. So I think when those demands change, it can leave women sort of wondering a little bit like, well, who am I beyond that role? The second part of that question, with feeling invisible at this stage, um, contributing factors like younger colleagues at work coming through, at home when children may not need us in the same way. And so even sometimes within the medical system where symptoms are dismissed or minimized. And I know like we talk about that all the time. Uh, and I think with very little cultural conversation about menopause, but again, it's getting better. I do feel like women are often feeling like they're navigating this major life transition without much recognition. Um, the third part is, I think, when someone feels unseen or unheard, not taken seriously, which is such a big part of it, self esteem is always going to take a hit. Confidence will dip, self doubt will increase, and those feelings of anxiety, low mood, that will tend to follow quite naturally after those feelings. And and it's not that a woman has lost her value at all. It's just that she's not feeling recognized and supported during such a significant transition.
Yeah. I mean, what are some ways that women could perhaps go about reclaiming visibility both internally and externally?
Oh, yes, reclaiming visibility. I think it begins internally. When women start reconnecting with their worth rather than measuring themselves by old roles, productivity, how much they can do for everybody else, I think this is when it can start to shift. And I think for many women, menopause is probably the first time our bodies have asked us to slow down, pay attention to you. And it becomes less about pushing through, more about listening. So, listening to the body, honoring some new limits, allowing this stage to, of life to sort of shape new, and I always say often wiser, and more self self-directed identity. I also think that reclaiming that visibility is also, it's about challenging the story that, again, I think I said earlier that many of us have told ourselves or heard about menopause, that it's a time of decline, getting older, reduced capacity, or becoming somehow less. And women often say to me, "Oh, I just don't have the capacity that I used to." And my reply to that is always, but what if our capacity actually hasn't reduced at all? What if it's just simply different after decades of doing everything for everybody else? Yet many women, again, have spent years juggling work, family, caregiving, households, and emotional stress. Menopause could be that moment for us when we realize that we just can't keep operating at that pace. And perhaps we're not meant to, instead of saying it is a loss, could become a realization that we matter too. And it's time to include ourselves in that whole care package.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on to relationships. Whew, big topic. Why does menopause often coincide with so many relationship turning points?
Oh, it really does, doesn't it? It almost feels very unjust and unfair when you look at the timing of it, because it often arrives during a phase where life is already full of transition. So perimenopause begins in the late 30s or early 40s, right when we're stepping into senior roles at work after perhaps years of building our careers. Then we're navigating, we get either children entering puberty or becoming more independent or even leaving home. Then at the same time, aging parents may need more support. And for some women, this also brings experience of, the illness, the caregiving and the loss. So when so many responsibilities, emotional demands, and identity, all those shifts happen at once, relationships are naturally, I think, always going to feel the strain. And, at this stage, many women begin reassessing what support and balance and connection that they truly need to move forward. And of course, to add to all these changes and everything coming at once, we're probably not sleeping, we're tired.
Mm.
Just to throw that in the mix.
Yeah, let's add that one in. Why not?
Yeah, why not?
Absolutely. So, how, from a couple's perspective,
Yeah.
when there is some, changes going on there, how can couples renegotiate, I guess, roles and expectations during this phase of life?
I love this question because I think it's an area that can have such a huge impact. And I've even written a cheat sheet for partners, which has got information about menopause, what's happening to her, and things like little phrases they can steal. But I think couples at this stage, let's just renegotiate roles and expectations by first building understanding around what menopause is and what's happening to her mentally, physically, because when both partners have got accurate information, it reframes, the changes in energy, mood, capacities as more biological shifts rather than coming across as blame. And that's really huge in a relationship during this time. But as we know, menopause affects, again, energy, mood, sleep, focus, stress. So what couples have always done, it might not any longer feel sustainable. So from there, learning to communicate differently, absolutely key. Speaking about needs with openness rather than frustration. And again, if we've got the education, we can do it from this perspective. And listening, with curiosity rather than defensiveness, because, and as expectations are adjusted to match this new season of life, blame will naturally soften, and it can often be replaced with compassion and teamwork and emotional connection. And I did have a little note, the phrases that he can steal.
Yes,
I
I
have
was
my
getting to
top
that.
three that I
Yes.
that I just love. The first one is, I can see this is really hard on you. How can I support you right now? The other one is, what do you need right now? Space, comfort, or a solution.
Ah, yes.
And the other one, which I think is probably my favorite, just to say to her, I'm here with you. We'll figure this out together.
Wow, I think yes. Any
Powerful.
women going through those would absolutely love to hear
Yeah.
any
And
one
just
of those.
thinking, please, I wish
Yeah.
he would just say that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Especially that second one because it's just knowing, where do you sit at the moment? Like, how can
Yes.
do I just need to go away off of the
Yeah,
outside? Well,
exactly.
yes,
And
please.
because it changes,
Yeah,
changes every day.
absolutely, absolutely. So I guess when women are being pulled in so many directions, and feeling that overwhelm, how can we protect our emotional reserves without feeling selfish? I mean, as you said, at those feelings of giving and nurturing do lessen, but after a decade or a lifetime of people pleasing, we don't
Yeah.
want to, not be there for people. So how do we kind of navigate that middle ground?
You mentioned like just protecting that emotional reserve. And I've always said it starts with kindness and patience toward ourselves. We're going through a lot. And, we've often extended that kindness and that patience toward everybody else, put ourselves last. And because we've often sort of been taught to put everyone else first. But in this time of our lives, like self-care, it's never selfish. It's so essential. When you're constantly giving without refilling, exhaustion and resentment often builds. I see that a lot. And mental health suffers. So my message is always put your own oxygen mask on first. You can't pour from an empty cup. That really applies here. So rest, boundaries, asking for help, and making space for your own needs. They're not indulgences. They're what allow us to keep showing up with care and clarity if we keep refilling our cup. And then, as you said, we can stay in those, partly in those roles of showing up and caring. So, but I think begin treating the well-being as a priority rather than an afterthought, which we've done for so long.
Yeah.
And then they often find that, they have more energy, more patience, and more emotional capacity for the people that they love.
For sure. I mean, you've
Yeah.
talked about the importance of talking with women going through similar experiences. Now, you've also started a peri and menopause support circle in the Illawarra region. So, what kind of benefits have you seen from bringing together women in this way?
Look, I think women can not only cope through this stage, but they can genuinely thrive
Yeah.
when we feel supported, informed, kind to each other, kind to ourselves, because this period often becomes a really meaningful and self-directed phase. And I think one of the biggest factors um, in thriving in menopause is community, not going through menopause alone. It's being part of that supportive space. And it allows women to feel understood, heard, taken seriously, share experiences and solutions. Like what works for one doesn't work for the other. But hey, give us all the information and we can work out what works best for us. And none of it's with judgment when you're sitting in a space with all of us that are going through the same thing. And it replaces isolation with connection. Now, the group is a little bit on hold at the moment. It's just a little bit on pause, just while I'm building a new model of support that is going to allow me even more to, support women and give them that, access to help in a flexible and affordable and ongoing way because it goes, perimenopause and menopause goes for many years.
Yes.
But it will absolutely start again soon because what I have found over the years is that community is just such a vital part of women thriving through this stage.
I
Yeah.
mean, how
Mm.
great would it be if there was support groups like this all over Australia where women could just meet up and connect? So I think that's
Absolutely. Yeah.
If you don't have it in your area, you should maybe, see if you can get one started.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of going out and saying, "Okay, ladies, who's up to meet at such and such cafe next Friday?"
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea.
And you don't have to be a counselor, or trained in women's mental health like me,
Mm.
because I'm part of that group as well.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
in a way, I'm 53, so I'm in the thick of it. I've just started my HRT with my transdermal gel.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But look, community is just, it really is, I think, the turning point, and that's the feedback. And I think that's what my new model of care is all about. I tried to look at it a little bit like a gym membership, but
Yeah.
for your mental and emotional well-being, when you can log in whenever you want, connect with others. There's always women there online. And we're all there for the same reason, and of course, you get to talk to the staff, which would be me, when you need support.
Yep.
And I think the beauty of that is, there's no waiting, there's no high session fees. It's just professional, you know, consistent, accessible care, just the way that I used to. And the feedback so far has been fantastic, especially for women that have either been priced out of care or find it difficult to get appointments when they need them. So, yeah, it's been really great to get that up and running.
Well, look, Melinda, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It was great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, I guess one of the powerful themes from this conversation is that while menopause can feel like a period of loss or upheaval, it can also be a time of reflection, recalibration, and growth. If you'd like to learn more about Melinda's work, including her menopause support circle and online model of care, we'll include the details in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode of Thriving in Menopause, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And for more great ideas on living your best life at midlife, be sure to pick up a copy of Prevention magazine. I'm Zoe Mernier. See you next time.